Do you think one mind is better than many? Neither do we. A University of Chicago Booth School of Business MBA is for curious and collaborative people who value different perspectives and ideas. Chicago Booth takes pride in empowering and being empowered by women of diverse backgrounds. We believe that fostering an inclusive community creates an environment of analytical, open-minded inquiry and produces knowledge with enduring impact. Learn more today at chicagobooth.edu/elevate. Welcome to the Ellevate podcast, conversations with women changing the face of business. Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Ellevate podcast, History Makers. I'm your host, Megan. I cannot wait for you to hear this week's interview. It is amazing. I just finished it up. It is with Jodi Calahoo-Stonehouse, who is the first First Nations woman elected to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. We talk about history. We talk about her advice for others following in her footsteps. We talk about being bold and how to take steps forward. She is just so inspirational, and she talks so much about, really getting to know her community, which is exactly what a politician should be in my mind, and I think in most people's minds, as the results of her election would show. And it's just such a great conversation, and I cannot wait for you to listen. So let's go ahead and cut to it now. Today we have with us Jodi Calahoo-Stonehouse, who is the first First Nations woman elected to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta.
Greetings, Tansatoya. Hello, thank you for having me, Ellevate.
We are thrilled. I love all of our history makers, but I always love it when we get international people, because it's so exciting to show there's history being made around the world.
Well, and for us, we don't see America as international. Turtle Island, that medicine line wasn't put in place by our people. We have the Blackfoot and the Blackfeet and the Mohawk with Aguasasni and Ganawage. We have families on both sides of the medicine line.
That is actually completely true. It's only international today. It certainly did not used to be.
That's right.
So our first question that we always ask everybody, I know it's a big question, but how did you get to where you are today?
I'm so delighted that you asked that. I'm here today doing the work that I'm doing because of the extraordinary elders I had in my life. I was so blessed to be raised by old people, to be taught by old people, and to continue to have relationships with many brilliant old people. None of my knowledge is mine. None of the things I say are mine. They are all things that I have listened to, observed, and been taught by my elders.
I love that. Yeah, and it's completely true. I think they are completely who make us who we are today.
Absolutely. Growing up as a young girl with my grandparents, we often were out picking berries, picking medicines. When I was 5 years old, I was out on the trap line, and my grandfather taught me how to make snares and how to trap. But while we were doing that, he was also talking about the biodiversity and the relationship between the mice and the hawks, and the relationship between the water beings and the land beings. And so my ecosystem biodiversity wisdom was so deeply entrenched by the time I became a teenager that I started to really care compassionately about the ways in which mining was impacting lands and waters.
And is that what led you into politics? Because I was wondering, what in your background made you want to go into, politics, which is a big risk.
Well, my mother is Mohawk, and, for her, I've always been deeply entrenched around gardening. And, she was very much raised us with an anti-racism lens, that we were to never treat anyone, whether they were queer, Black, Muslim, any different than ourselves. And she indoctrinated that deeply in me. And so, it wasn't until I was about 17 years old when I tried out for a fire department, and my I guess, the student who was the same age as me in grade 11 got in and I didn't, based on gender, that I started to see the world a little differently. I'd been, protected. My grandparents and parents had worked very hard to protect me. And I essentially was raised in this utopia where, racialized women were just as powerful as non racialized people. And that was the moment where I started to be critical of things. And of course, as my post secondary education progressed and as my experience progressed as an adult, I just couldn't tolerate sort of any indifference around racism, gender, queerness. I mean, this is 2023. The amount of peer reviewed literature, the amount of documentation we have on how these things cause harm, it's long overdue that governments, whether they be international, national, take leadership and ensure that all citizens, regardless of how they enact their gender, how they enact their sexuality, their race, is treated with equity and love and compassion and has the opportunity to thrive in their homelands.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes people will think of that almost as an American problem. They don't realize it is an issue all throughout the world.
Very much so. And that's why so many folks around the world come to America or Canada, is because we are the safe place. Well, if we are the safe place in the world, the American dream or the Canadian dream, then we had better embody those things around happiness, liberty, freedom, all of those, statements we say we embody. Well, let's make sure that we do.
Absolutely. So, there was a lot of history actually made in Alberta. You actually weren't the only one making history because Rhiannon Hoyle also made history as the first Black woman elected to the Legislative Assembly of Alberta. Is that like a sign to you that, people want change moving forward? They want representation.
Things are a changing, baby. It's a beautiful and remarkable time. Not only do we have our first First Nations woman, our first Black woman, we also have the largest LGBTQ plus as well. And there was another thing that we made history around. I think the most diversified team ever. If we look at the folks, I don't have the list in front of me, but I think we've got folks from almost around the world who make up part of the New Democrats here in Alberta, which is quite extraordinary because if we look at Alberta and Canada and America, we really are the safe place for the world. And so representation needs to be also reflected.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, did you start out in like community politics before you got, a little higher up? Or what was that journey like kind of navigating through the world of politics?
When I was in grade 12, there was a competition, and it was at the Native Friendship Center in Calgary. And I remember the elder, Maggie Blackkettle. She was almost 100 years old, and she was a Blackfoot woman. And she was sitting in the audience, and we had to do oral presentations to these elders. And she pulled me aside and she said, "You would have won if you could have spoken your language. Therefore, we gave you second place." And, growing up, I often heard from our elders, you have to know where you came from in order to know where you're going. And also, our language is one of the most vital and important pieces of our identity. And so, for me, that was the pivotal moment where I was like, I am going to be a language speaker. I'm going to learn my language and I'm going to continue publicly speaking. And then when I was probably about 20, I joined my First Nations Band Council as a council member and spent 2 terms as a counselor. And as I was pursuing a Master's of Science in Resource Economics, that's when I really got involved because of my history on the land as a trapper and a fisher person, looking at the impacts of mining in my own territory was really what moved me and mobilized me to get more deeply entrenched in politics in a much larger scale.
Absolutely. And I think people don't realize that language itself can be an act of resistance, can be an act of culture.
Oh, it's a beautiful act of resistance. And it's so important for all of us from around the world who come from language and culture to ensure that we are teaching our children our languages, our cultures, our songs, our foods. That's what makes us who we are. And those are to be celebrated and embraced as well as invested in.
Yes. So one thing I want to point out, so you say, everything that you are comes from your elders. One day, people are going to look up to you as one of theirs. What is something that you hope some of the future generations can learn from you or can take from everything you're doing?
I really hope that my work makes space for other folks to follow. And it's not that I want anyone to ever take or be anything like me. I want folks to be their beautiful and powerful selves, and that we're making space in all of the right places for people to bring their glorious queer, racialized selves into positions of power and authority, into positions where decisions are being made, that we are reflecting who we are as a citizenry in the political body. We have to do things differently. We can no longer look at old white men to be the sole source of decision making. Yes, they are a part of it, but they are not the entirety. And so I think, if anything, if I make an impact in any way, it's that I'm making space for others to bring their beautiful critical minds.
Amen. And as a member of the LGBTQ community in the middle of Pride Month, I don't know if it will be when we release this, but it is as recording this. Just yes, 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 yes.
I love it. I love it. Yes, we've had many celebrations here. And for in my family and in my culture, this notion of two spirit, which is a relatively new term, has been, along with our families long before Christianity and colonization arrived here. So, we've had a role, and a very significant role, in our families, in our clan system, for folks who have the ability to embody more than one gender, or the ability to be something different than what often is prescribed by Western ideology. For us, historically, it was about being who you choose to be. And, if you choose to act like a man and be in the bush and work like the men, it was embraced as a woman. You didn't have to wear a flag to protect you. You didn't have to be different, prior to the church arriving. You just got to be who you were, and it was respected, and it was a place of privilege in our society. If someone could embody both genders, that was seen as a person of medicine, a person of compassion. They often were put in positions of healing or leadership. And so we have to do our own internal work as Indigenous peoples to these lands around reclaiming that, and, ensuring that our young people feel safe and are lifted to those positions of privilege and are lifted to those positions of leadership, because historically that's what they were. And we have to, as we heal the wound of the Indian residential schools, as we heal the legacy of colonization, part of that work is, the revitalization of our two spirit.
Absolutely. And that's actually, even as a member of the LGBTQ community, I'm a bisexual woman. That history was something that I didn't even learn until a few years ago, is that really this, I guess, just call it a heteronormative culture that we live in, really was a cause of like Western Christian colonization. It is not by any means, the way things have always been. It was brought in, and it is not true for many, many cultures around the world.
Yeah, and sadly, along with that has come a lot of violence to a lot of our two spirit, and a lot of violence to queer identifying peoples, and violence to our women. Of course, you are aware of the missing and murdered Indigenous women and two spirit and girls. And, we have a lot of work to do to protect queer identity, a lot of work to do to protect women and those who identify differently. as leaders, that's our job, to ensure that all citizens have a right to thrive and live their best, beautiful lives. And that's what I intend to do, sitting in government, is to ensure that all those babies behind me get the best possible opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And yes, you bring attention to a very, very important point. Missing Indigenous people are, I believe, they're the most at risk to go missing, specifically Indigenous women. It's such an issue on society. And I think from what I've seen, the media finally seems to be calling attention to it. And I think it is more than well past time.
There is an extraordinary artist named Christy Belcourt who put together the Walking with Our Sisters art installation that traveled across Canada. And it was moccasin vamps that were sewn by family members of lost or missing or murdered women, two-spirit, and girls. And the moccasin vamps grew to be over 1,700 that traveled across the country. And it was such a beautiful reflection of identity. You could see the Dene, the Cree, the Blackfoot, the Mohawk, the Haudenosaunee. You could see the different tribes reflected in the beadwork and the ways in which those moccasin vamps were prepared. It was also a moment of, a startling realization that these women and Two-Spirit have been murdered or are missing. Like, okay, we have got to start protecting our vulnerable people. We have got to do better.
I completely, completely agree. And yes. So, one thing I always like to ask our history makers is, do you have any advice for others who are following in your footsteps? Whether that's, getting into politics or preserving the culture, anything, any advice?
Absolutely. Be brave. You have to go into the places and spaces where you don't belong, where you feel uncomfortable. You have to talk to the people who maybe in your mind perceive are part of the problem or perpetrators. You have to be brave and stand up to them and have conversations. We have to learn how to communicate with folks who don't have our point of view or our perspective, because we have to solve these problems together. And so, often it's difficult, for me as an Indigenous woman to be in the house where colonization lives and thrives. And, that's part of me being brave, but also being rooted in ceremony, making sure you go back to the place where you have your prayer, your connection, your meditation, where you feel connected to whether it's God, Allah, the Great Spirit, Wahka, however you identify something outside of yourself. It's vital in these places and spaces for your mental health, is to, nurture yourself through spirituality, whatever form that takes. And for me, that's making sure I'm sun dancing, I'm making an offering, I'm going to sweats regularly, I'm with my elders, and I'm also going to other places of faith, places where I wasn't raised to know or to believe in or to be comfortable in, but I know that others believe and love those ways. And so by being brave, I, submerse myself in other faiths and learn. So that way we can start to have conversations about where we do align. Because often we are coming to the table talking about where we don't agree, and then we're not coming in with any solutions, and in fact, causing more harm. So, how about we look at the places where we might align, where we might agree, so we can have a baseline to start to do some work, some transformative work. So having faith, being brave, nourish yourself, make sure you go to the gym or you're out on the walks. And for me, it's the river valley. I go every day with my dog and I give thanks to the water, Nipi. I give thanks to that muskiki, to that medicine for life. I'm in the trees and connected to Creator. So for me, that's vitally important. And you have to surround yourself with brilliant minds, because we don't have all the answers. I don't have all the answers, but there are some extraordinary folks in the world who are really brilliant. And so you got to build yourself a network, a team of really insightful, wise, compassionate folks who want to also make change happen. So surround yourself with those brilliant, compassionate people. Give thanks, have faith, nurture yourself, which means you're sleeping well, you're nourishing your body with, healthy foods. For us, Milpamatsu and living our best lives means we're also eating our traditional foods. Our bodies recognize the DNA of those berries that the moose ate. And then when I eat that moose meat, my DNA is recognizing sort of that cyclical of life and death cycle in the foods we eat. So eat your traditional foods. It's important to nourish your spirit and your body. If there's anything I can tell you for advice, if you want to get into politics or change making, it's you got to be brave. And in order to be brave, you need good people around you, you need faith, and you need good food and nourishment.
Absolutely. And I love that you bring up, being bold and brave and stepping into places where you might be uncomfortable. And you mentioned the Canadian government. People, I don't know if all of my American listeners will know, but the Canadian government was directly tied to the absolute tragedy that was the Indigenous residential school system, where thousands upon thousands of Indigenous children lost their lives, lost their culture, and it's it's a beautiful thing to be a part of representation, but I cannot imagine what it must be like to be the first.
And, in Alberta, that if we think about the legacy of the Indian residential schools, we still have more children, Indigenous children, in child and family services, which is the apprehension of Indigenous children and placed in non Indigenous homes. So it may not be the residential schools, but we still have the epidemic of Indian children being taken away from their language, their family, and placed in non Indian homes where it's not their language, not their family, and where they're not loved. We have over 13,000 children in my territory in Alberta at this time. That's a lot of children who don't have their mom and dad, and that's a tremendous amount of moms and dads who don't have their children. So the legacy is not over, and the work is really just beginning. We must heal ourselves as First Nations, Indigenous, Métis, Inuit families. We have to do that healing work and take our babies back. We have to reclaim our babies and, have thriving, healthy, beautiful families. And that's going to take a major investment from the government and from organizations and from citizens, just typical human beings saying, how can we support? How can we help? How can we love? How can we ensure that you're able to raise your babies? What can I do as your neighbor? As your neighbor. And I think because of technology, consumerism, all of the isms, if you will, we have forgotten how to be good neighbors to each other.
I agree. And is there anything that you would recommend that anyone at home, listening now can do?
Start by going next door, introducing yourself, saying hello, get to know people. We need to restore this notion of community, of villages, of tribes, of looking after each other because, individuality is not working. Not everyone is going to be a millionaire and be able to afford all the staff you need to be successful. Individuality is not going to build better communities. It's not going to build better schools or hospitals or a better world. We have to know each other. We have to take our time to get to know one another, each other's beliefs. Whether you're in America or Canada, take some time to know someone who you didn't know before, who's of different faith, who's of different skin color. Be brave.
100%. So I want to go to, the day of the election. What was that feeling as, the results rolled in and as you, started to realize that you were probably about to win this?
I was so blessed to have so many extraordinary volunteers who worked day in and day out, door knocking, phone calling, And because of the work on the doorsteps that took place months before, there was no doubt in my mind that I was going to win. I knew I would. I was nervous about introducing our leader. I was asked to introduce our leader at the event. I was more nervous about that. I mean, of course, there was always the, ooh, what if? But I don't know. There was just without any uncertainty. I was sure because of the work that had gone in, not only months, but years before. I started door knocking a year and a half before the election. So my goal was to make sure I made it to every doorstep in my constituency prior to the election.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I think that all goes back to community. Like you said, get to know your community. And if you know the community, I'm sure it didn't come as a surprise that you won, because you said, I know these people.
Exactly. And not only do I know them, I care about them. I love them. I know about some of the adversity some are facing. I'm aware of the celebrations. And so it's an exciting opportunity to bridge the reality and bridge the gap between my constituency, which is predominantly upper middle class white community, with First Nations lived reality. So I really am honored and humbled to be able to represent both groups of peoples and to be able to really do the work of reconciliation and be a leader in that, in building those relationships. And I don't take it for granted that I'm in this position, and I am thoroughly thankful and really excited about the work that lies ahead.
100%. So we're coming up to the end now, and I always finish our History Makers episodes by asking, we all stand on the shoulders of those who've made history before us, of those who've come before us. So I always want to ask, who is a history maker or history makers that inspired you?
There are many, but the ones that come off the top of my head is Chief Rose Laboucan from Driftpile Cree Nation, and Regina Crowchild from the Tsuut'ina Nation. I just watched these women in the Chiefs Assembly, and they just would bring this grandeur and this poise and this clarity to leadership. And even though they were in a room with 40 male chiefs, they held the authority and they were extraordinary with their eloquence. They are some of the giants that I get to stand on. And then, of course, there is my ceremonial families, the Latenders in Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation, and the Crees out in Musquechees, my Musham, who has been with me the past decade in my political endeavors. So I've just been so blessed with so many extraordinary women, men, two-spirit, who have really invested in me to be all that I am. So I am standing on many, many shoulders, and I am thankful.
I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Hi, Nanaskaman. I'm really grateful for this time to share some of my thoughts.
And I'm going to put in a link to her website in the description. So be sure to be on the lookout for that.
Beautiful. And you can find me in the trees.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for coming on. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate your time.
Ellevate Network drives real results for ambitious women trying to break through the glass ceiling and achieve success in their careers. We offer a platform full of resources and opportunities for growth, all designed to help you unlock your potential. With Ellevate support, you can take the first step toward achieving your professional goals. With a supportive community and tangible resources at your fingertips, you're only one step away from reaching your fullest potential. Join us today and take advantage of our 30-day free trial to start building the career of your dreams. Thanks so much for listening to the Ellevate podcast. If you like what you hear, you can subscribe, give us 5 stars, and share your review. You can learn all about Ellevate membership and all the great things that Ellevate Network is doing at our website, www.ellevatenetwork.com. That's ELLEVATE network.com. And special thanks to our producer, Catherine Heller. She rocks. Thanks so much, and join us next week.